In 1876, two men walked into the most important factory in America. They weren't employees. They weren't investors. They were spies. And what they stole that autumn didn't just destroy one company. It redirected the entire course of global industry. Between 1850 and 1957, one factory on a Massachusetts river produced 40 million timepieces. Watches, bomb fuses, aircraft instruments, railroad chronometers certified in 52 countries. The watch Abraham Lincoln carried to the Gettysburg Address. The clock that guided Lindbergh across the Atlantic. The world's first waterproof watch. 8 years before Rolex made the one everyone remembers. Henry Ford visited this factory and credited it as the direct inspiration for the automobile assembly line. Every production line on Earth today traces directly back to 22 brick buildings along the Charles River in Waltham, Massachusetts. Then the Swiss stole the secrets. Then the market changed. Then the government withheld a loan. Then 1,200 workers walked out on a February morning in 1950 and never came back. The name, Waltham Watch Company, was sold to a Chicago company, put on watches made overseas. Today the brand is owned by a Swiss company. The country whose spies destroyed the original Waltham now owns its name. This is the story of American industrial genius, its theft, and its quiet, unheroic death. This is the dark story of the Waltham Watch Company. Before we go any further, where are you watching this from? Drop your city in the comments. We have viewers from all over the world, and given that this story ends with a Swiss company owning an American name, that geography feels especially pointed today. If you're new here, subscribe. We tell the forgotten stories of American industry, and this one may be the most consequential we've ever covered. Now, let's go back to where it began, not in Waltham, but in a shoemaker's house in Maine, and a son who refused to make shoes. March 6, 1812, Freeport, Maine. Andrew Dennison made shoes. His son Aaron would not. Aaron Lufkin Dennison grew up watching his father cut leather into the same shapes, day after day, with the same tools, in the same small workshop. The cobbler's trade was honest, repetitive, and entirely uninteresting to a boy with, as contemporaries would later describe it, a mechanical turn of mind. At 18, he left his father's workshop and apprenticed himself to James Carey of Brunswick. Clockmaker, gunsmith, goldsmith. A combination of trades that told you everything about what precision meant in 1830 America. You learned time and weapons together because both required the same discipline, tolerances that did not forgive error. By the early 1830s, Dennison was in Boston working for 3 months without wages at the Jeweler, Currier, and Trott, simply to be in proximity to skilled craftsmen. He then secured a position under Tubal Hone at Jones, Low and Ball, considered by his contemporaries the finest watchmaker in America. He was learning not just technique, but aspiration. What a watch could be if made with absolute precision. What precision required if it was to scale beyond a single craftsman's bench. He was also quietly failing at almost everything else he tried. A watch repair business of his own failed. A jewelry store with his brother failed. Silk farming. He attempted to grow silkworms on a farm in Massachusetts, certain the American textile industry needed a domestic silk supply. Failed. He was 30 years old, then 35, then 40. Accumulating the experience of a man who sees possibilities others don't, and lacks repeatedly the resources or execution to realize them. A paper box business started in 1844, almost by accident, succeeded beyond any of his intentional ventures. It eventually became the Dennison Manufacturing Company, a substantial enterprise still in operation decades later. Aaron handed it to his brother, turned away, and returned to the consuming problem he had never solved. He didn't care about boxes. He cared about watches. The question that had occupied him for over a decade was one the entire watch trade had agreed was unanswerable. Not merely difficult, not merely expensive, but categorically impossible given the precision required. Dennison had seen something at the Springfield Armory in Massachusetts that he could not stop thinking about. The government's primary firearms facility had, over decades of development, learned to manufacture guns using fully interchangeable parts. Machines cut metal to specifications so precise that any trigger could fit any trigger guard from any gun in the same production run. A broken lock could be repaired with a replacement part pulled from a bin. Parts were not fitted by a craftsman's hand to a specific weapon. They were made by machines to tolerances, and they fit everything. The result was mass production of reliable firearms at unprecedented speed and cost, faster, cheaper, more consistent than any craftsman's workshop could approach. What had come to be called the American system of manufacturing. Dennison's question? Why not watches? The answer everyone gave was simple, and, they believed, final. Guns are large, watch components are microscopic. The escapement wheel of a pocket watch has teeth measuring fractions of a millimeter. The mainspring fits a barrel, measured in hundredths of an inch. The jewel holes that the pivots of the gear train run through must be positioned to tolerances that don't merely require skill. They require machine tools of a category that did not yet exist. Building the machines to cut and position such components consistently, not once, not 10 times, but thousands of times per day, identically, indefinitely. This was not merely difficult. It was, by the engineering consensus of the era, impossible. Dennison decided the consensus was wrong. In 1849, at 37 years old, having spent 2 decades thinking about this problem, and nearly as many failing at unrelated businesses, he brought his plan to Edward Howard, partner in Howard and Davis, a thriving manufacturer of wall clocks, sewing machines, and fire engines in Roxbury, Massachusetts. Edward Howard was not in the watch business, but he understood precision, and he had access to capital. The financial backing came primarily from Howard's father-in-law, Samuel Curtis, a man whose own fortune had been built in small arms manufacturing. The connection between firearms precision and watch precision was not metaphorical. It was financial, direct, and deliberate. The man who had made money making guns was now funding the attempt to apply what gun making had learned to something far smaller. They built their first factory in a single room at the Howard and Davis Clockworks in Roxbury. They hired both Swiss and American watchmakers. They began designing machines. Dennison traveled to England to study watchmaking methods, to acquire parts, to hire journeymen who understood European horological technique. He returned and designed more machinery. The first product, a watch running 8 days on a single winding, a genuine technical achievement, was a commercial failure, too expensive to produce. The machinery Dennison had designed could not deliver the tolerances required at production cost. Charles Moseley, a skilled machinist who arrived during this period, quietly rebuilt what Dennison's designs had gotten wrong. In his own autobiography written late in his life, Dennison stated plainly that he had, and this is his phrase, no ability as a machinist. He was the vision. Someone else would always have to be the execution. The company changed names 3 times in 4 years: American Horologe Company, then Warren Manufacturing Company, then Boston Watch Company, each renaming reflecting a reorganization, a new round of financing, a fresh attempt to solve the underlying economic problem of producing precision goods at scale. In 1854, they moved operations from Roxbury to a rural town on the Charles River called Waltham, Massachusetts. Population approximately 5,000, specifically because the cleaner air away from Boston's industrial smoke would protect the watch movements from contaminating particles. Local investors organized the Waltham Improvement Company, purchased 100 acres of Charles River farmland, and built the first purpose-built factory building on the site. Operations began in October of 1854, 90 workers, 30 watches per week. The economics failed almost immediately. The company burned through its capital. Sales could not cover production costs at that scale. In 1857, the financial panic that swept the American economy struck Waltham at its most vulnerable moment. Undercapitalized, still not producing at profitable volumes, dependent on continued investment from shareholders who were watching their money disappear. The Waltham Improvement Company foreclosed on the factory mortgage. The assets were distributed at a sheriff's auction in the autumn of 1857. Royal E. Robbins, A New York watch importer bought the entire enterprise for $56,000. Dennison stayed on as superintendent of the mechanical department. He remained there for 4 more years, continuing to contribute, apparently, to involve himself more broadly in the operations than his title strictly permitted. In 1861, Robbins dismissed him. The record of the dismissal is specific, neglecting his duties and meddling with other departments. He was 49 years old. He had conceived the company, persuaded the investors, redesigned the system, moved the factory, laid the theoretical and organizational foundations on which everything that followed would rest. He walked out of Waltham and never came back. He founded 3 more watch-related companies in the years that followed: a watchmaking venture in Zurich that failed, an attempted watch manufacturing in Cincinnati that came to nothing. Only the last truly succeeded, the Dennison Watch Case Company in Birmingham, England, so established in 1874, which supplied cases to Rolex and Omega, and continued operating until 1967. He died in Birmingham on January 9, 1895, at 82 years old, making watch cases for Swiss manufacturers. He never knew the complete arc of what his idea became. He never knew about the espionage. He never knew that the company he'd been fired from would eventually be owned, in trademark if not in spirit, by the country whose industry he had nearly destroyed. He made watch cases for them until the end, and they paid him for the work, and he died in their city. And they survived him by generations. Robbins had purchased a machine and an idea. The machine needed improvement. The idea needed proof. Both were about to arrive. To understand what Robbins was working with, what Dennison had actually built, and what remained to be constructed, you need to understand what making a watch had meant before 1850, and why machine production had seemed so definitively impossible. A pocket watch in 1849 contained over 160 moving components. Each component was unique to the watch it belonged to. Not unique in design, every pallet fork performed the same function, but unique in fit. The escapement wheel in a given watch had been hand-filed by a craftsman to mesh precisely with the pallet fork in that specific watch. The mainspring had been fitted by hand to its specific barrel. The balance wheel had been regulated by hand to its specific movement. The relationship between parts was personal, not systematic. If a wheel broke, you returned the watch to its maker, or you found another craftsman who would file a replacement by hand to fit what was already there. You could not simply order a part from stock. There was no stock. There were only craftsmen and their benches and the individual relationships between components they had personally fitted. This was the medieval guild system, surviving almost entirely intact into the industrial age. Separate specialists in separate workshops producing separate components that were then assembled by a master watchmaker who personally fitted everything. Slow, expensive, by its fundamental nature, resistant to scale. Skilled watchmakers spent years, sometimes decades, mastering their craft. Their labor was irreplaceable. Their output was limited by the hours in a day and the number of trained hands available. And their product cost what that labor demanded, which meant a reliable pocket watch was a luxury object, owned by merchants, professionals, landowners, and the wealthy. Not by workers, not by farmers, not by the ordinary majority of the population. Dennison had seen the Springfield Armory. Moseley had rebuilt the machinery that answered Dennison's question. And then Ambrose Webster arrived and made the answer permanent. Webster joined Waltham's machine shop sometime after the 1854 move and eventually became its superintendent. The role was deceptively titled. Webster wasn't assembling watches. He was building the machines that built the machines that built the watches. Under his supervision, the machine shop grew from a handful of workers to approximately 50 machinists. Roughly 6% of the entire workforce, dedicated entirely to designing, constructing, and maintaining the precision tools that made every other department function. The fixtures that held components at exact angles during cutting. The gauges that verified dimensions to thousandths of an inch. The specialized cutters that produced the teeth of an escapement wheel, identically, one after another, hour after hour, year after year. Every machine on every floor of the Waltham factory had come from Webster's shop. He was the man who made Dennison's idea physically real. What they built collectively, Dennison's concept, Moseley's reconstruction, Webster's execution, was the first vertically integrated precision manufacturing operation in history. Raw material entered one end. Finished, fully interchangeable watch movements emerged at the other. Every one of 160-plus components produced under one roof by machine to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, and made fully interchangeable with every equivalent component in every watch of the same model. Any balance wheel could replace any balance wheel. Any mainspring fit any barrel. A broken gear was not a trip to a craftsman. It was a replacement from a bin of parts that had been machine cut to identical specification. The factory that housed this operation grew steadily along the Charles River through the 1850s, 60s, and beyond, adding buildings as production scaled, until by the 1880s it covered approximately 8 acres and 22 interconnected structures, totaling 400,000 square feet. The architectural style, Queen Anne and Romanesque Revival industrial, was unusually refined for a manufacturing complex. Arched windows in regimented rows flooded the production floors with natural light. This was not decorative generosity. Workers handling components measured in thousandths of an inch needed to see what they were touching. The building had been designed around the work. Every architectural choice served precision. By 1876, the factory was producing 2,200 finished watch movements per day. By 1884, cumulative output had passed 2.5 million. At peak employment, 2,400 workers arrived each morning, found their place at long benches beneath those arched windows, and assembled objects they could barely feel between their fingers. Henry Ford II confirmed what watch historians had long documented. His grandfather visited the Waltham Watch Company and came away with the direct inspiration for the automobile assembly line. The most famous factory of the 20th century learned its fundamental operating principle from the most important factory of the 19th. But in 1876, while Waltham was winning gold medals at Philadelphia and inspiring the industrialists who would define the next century, 2 men arrived in that city who were watching the factory for reasons that had nothing to do with admiration and everything to do with survival. Before the spies, though, before the reckoning that Philadelphia set in motion, there was a war, and the war built the empire that would later be stolen. Robin's $56,000 purchase at the sheriff's auction had preserved the company at its lowest moment. What revived it was something no investment could have planned for. The Civil War began in 1861, and the United States Army needed to know what time it was. Troop movements across the vast distances of the American continent required coordination. A general who ordered an attack at dawn needed his officers, spread across miles of field, to agree on what dawn meant. Synchronized timing was a military necessity, and there were almost no portable clocks in the field. A soldier who needed to know the time needed a watch. The problem was that accurate watches cost more than most enlisted men earned in several months. The market for personal timekeeping had been a luxury market, and the Army needed to equip hundreds of thousands of men. Robbins created a watch called the William Ellery, named for one of the lesser-known signers of the Declaration of Independence. Priced at $13. $13 was approximately 2 months' wages for a Union private. Not cheap, but reachable. Durable enough for campaign conditions. Accurate enough for field coordination. The William Ellery was not Waltham's most elegant product. It wasn't meant to be. It was meant to work in a pocket through 4 years of war. It did. The watch became known simply as the soldier's watch, and by 1865 the William Ellery represented 44.5% of all Waltham unit sales. Hundreds of thousands of Union troops carried one. In January of 1863, a Waltham William Ellery, 11 jewels, 18-size movement, silver hunter case, serial number 67,613, was presented to Abraham Lincoln following the Gettysburg Address. The most consequential speech in the American language, and the man who delivered it, was marked afterward with a Waltham watch. In the final full year of the war, Waltham's profits reached 164% of capital. The company that had been auctioned for $56,000 8 years earlier had become something its founders had only imagined. The machines worked, the system worked, the economics finally decisively worked. What the war also did, and this mattered more in the long run than the profit margins, was cultural. Millions of American men who had never owned a watch were issued or purchased one. They carried it through 4 years of combat. When the war ended and they went home, they took the watch with them. They showed their children how to wind it. Their children grew up knowing what time it was. The concept of personal, precise timekeeping spread across the American population in a single generation, carried by veterans. By the 1870s, the expectation that a person could be somewhere at a specific hour, not approximately, not eventually, but at the stated time, had become the foundation of daily commercial and social life. That expectation required that ordinary working people own accurate personal timepieces. Waltham had made that possible for the first time in history. The railroads were the second transformation, and they were the one that made Waltham a global institution rather than simply a very successful manufacturer. Train scheduling required synchronization across hundreds of miles of track. A conductor 2 minutes fast and an engineer 2 minutes slow could meet head-on at a curve. On October 12, 1891, at Kipton, Ohio, exactly that happened. A conductor's watch had stopped for 4 seconds, then resumed running. He believed he had time to clear a siding before a passenger express arrived. He did not. The collision killed the engineer, firemen, and several others. The railroad industry convened immediately and established what became the general railroad timepiece standards. Watches used by operating personnel must lose or gain no more than 30 seconds per week. They must be adjusted to 5 temperature positions. They must have a minimum jewel count. They must be lever set, meaning the hands could not be accidentally moved by a bump or fall. They must be open-faced so the conductor could read the time without opening the case and introducing the risk of dropped components. Waltham met every requirement and was among the first manufacturers certified. Their railroad-grade movements were eventually adopted as the standard instrument for rail operations in 52 countries across 7 continents. More Waltham watches were operating in the world's railway systems than all other watch brands combined. By the mid-1880s, the company had renamed itself the American Waltham Watch Company, a name that wore its ambition without apology. It was America's watch. It was the standard against which every other watchmaker on earth measured itself. And at the Philadelphia Centennial Exhibition of 1876, the World's Fair celebrating a century of American independence, attended by 10 million visitors from around the world. A Swiss mechanical expert named Theo Grebe stood at Waltham's exhibit, watched the production line operate, walked to the exhibition's astronomical observatory, and tested 10 Waltham movements against astronomical measurements. His verdict, cabled back to Switzerland, was 4 words translated directly from French: "We have been left behind." The panic of 1873 had come close to destroying the Swiss watch industry entirely. Swiss watch exports had collapsed from 366,000 pieces in 1872 to just 75,000 by 1876, a reduction of nearly 80% in 4 years. The cottage industry system that had made Swiss watchmaking internationally synonymous with quality for centuries, artisans making components in separate home workshops throughout the Jura Valley, passing work between locations, assembling by hand in small ateliers, could not compete with a factory producing 2,200 movements per day. The Swiss could not match Waltham's price. They could not match the volume. They could not match the consistency that fully interchangeable machine-made parts provided. The prospect confronting them was not gradual competitive decline. It was annihilation. The Intercantonal Society of Jura Industries, the Swiss watchmakers' trade organization, convened to address the American threat. Their first answer was not to modernize production. It was to understand, with the precision their industry was famous for, exactly how Waltham worked, how the machines were designed, how the factory was organized, what each process cost, where the vulnerabilities lay. To obtain that intelligence, they needed someone who could get inside the factory. They sent Jacques David. David was 31 years old, the technical director of Longines, connected by family to Longines's manager, Ernest Francillon. His formal assignment, recorded in the organization's own documents, make a serious and detailed report of the organization, tools, financial situation, and in general, any other aspect of American watch factories. His actual assignment was exactly what those words described, except that Waltham had not consented to the examination. He arrived in America in the late summer of 1876 and joined Theo Grebe, who was completing his assessment in the wake of the centennial. Between mid-August and November, the two men traveled to American watch factories, Elgin in Illinois, Howard in Massachusetts, and others. They sketched machine tools through the fences and from public viewing positions. They documented production flows. They assembled financial intelligence that should not have been obtainable by any outsider operating legitimately. David went further than his official role permitted. One morning, before the 7 o'clock whistle, he walked through Waltham's gates without identifying himself or his purpose. His French accent attracted no suspicion. French Canadians were among the most common workers in industrial New England, and Waltham itself employed Swiss immigrants. He moved through the departments floor by floor, observing without drawing attention. He noted the silence. Workers barely spoke. They barely moved beyond the immediate demands of their task. Some workshops had been decorated by the workers themselves. Curtains on the windows, paintings on the walls, photographs of fellow workers, small arrangements of flowers on the benches. There was no shouting, no visible supervision beyond the work itself. The discipline was internal. The concentration was total. It was, David would record in his report, nothing like what he had expected of an industrial factory. It was more like a collective act of craft performed by a large number of people simultaneously. What observation alone could not deliver was the financial data, the internal cost structures, the machinery valuations, the production economics that told you not just how Waltham made its watches, but whether the model could be replicated profitably at lower cost in Switzerland. For that information, David needed a source inside the company, or formerly inside it. He found one at the Centennial Exhibition. Ambrose Webster had retired from Waltham in June of 1876 after 19 years as superintendent of the machine shop. He was, in precise terms, the man who had built everything, every tool in every department. Every fixture that positioned a component during cutting, every gauge that verified a dimension, the entire mechanical apparatus that made the factory's system function had been designed, built, or overseen by Webster's department. He was, in the circles that understood such things, the founding father of American precision manufacturing. A figure of genuine historical importance, a man whose contributions would eventually be honored in serious histories of industrial development. He was also, as scholarship published in 2022 finally established, a traitor. Whether Webster arrived at the Centennial specifically to sell what he knew, or whether the meeting with David was accidental and the arrangement developed gradually, is not resolved by the available historical record. What is documented is what happened afterward. Webster became David's primary source of intelligence. He provided detailed information on Waltham's machine tool designs, the designs he had personally created over 19 years. He provided information on the company's internal financial structures. He told David things that David could not have observed from any factory floor or learned from any public source. In September of 1876, David wrote to Switzerland, "I cannot recommend wholeheartedly that W be engaged by a group of manufacturers or by one company, but I still believe this man will be a great help in any reorganization measures that we decide to implement." When David published his final report, he recommended Webster by name as the most knowledgeable supplier of watchmaking machinery available. Within months of that recommendation, Webster had invested in a venture producing watchmaking equipment for Swiss manufacturers. The founding father of American precision manufacturing had sold the blueprints of what he had built to the industry that would use them to build a competitor that killed his company, for money, for business opportunity. For whatever combination of grievance and calculation moves a man to betray a 19-year investment. The historical record does not tell us what Webster felt about it. The outcome tells us everything else. David and Grebe completed their intelligence work and sailed back to Switzerland. The report they produced ran to 130 pages. Comprehensive, technically precise, financially detailed. It was distributed quietly to a limited number of Swiss manufacturers and then suppressed, deliberately kept out of public circulation to prevent any awareness of how the Swiss transformation had been achieved. The report remained effectively hidden for 125 years. It was published finally in 1992, translated to English in 2003. Watch historians describe it as probably the most important document in the history of modern watchmaking. The Swiss took what David and Webster had delivered and applied it systematically. Mechanized production began replacing cottage industry methods. Government investment supported the transition. Swiss labor costs were substantially lower than American, and Swiss manufacturers had the additional advantage of operating in a country that was not going to draft their workers into a war. Manufacturers that had been near bankruptcy in 1876, Longines, and through different corporate paths, the ancestors of Omega, Patek Philippe, Vacheron Constantin, rebuilt themselves on the mechanical principles they had acquired from Massachusetts, adapted them to Swiss cost structures and design aesthetics, and began manufacturing at volumes that had previously been impossible for them. By 1913, Swiss watch imports to the United States had increased 500% from their 1876 levels. The phrase that eventually entered the English language, running like a Swiss watch, described flawless, reliable, perfect mechanical performance. It described everything Waltham had been first. For 37 years after Philadelphia, Waltham did not know what had been set in motion. The company continued to expand. The empire it had constructed was real, was still growing, and showed no visible cracks. The railroad watch business alone, 52 countries, 7 continents, the certified standard for rail operations around the world, was an achievement without precedent. At peak employment in the 1880s and 90s, 2,400 workers produced a catalog that stretched from the $13 soldier's watch at one end to the Riverside Maximus at the other. A 23-jewel movement machined and finished to tolerances that handmade Swiss watches rarely matched, built for discriminating collectors and railroad superintendents who demanded the finest instrument available. The Riverside Maximus is bought by serious collectors today for thousands of dollars. In the 1880s, it was simply what Waltham made when it decided to make the best possible thing. The international recognition was unambiguous. At the Philadelphia Centennial of 1876, Waltham had won the gold medal for watchmaking over every Swiss and European competitor. At the Paris Exposition Universelle of 1878, judges awarded the grand prize to Waltham Movements, the highest honor available, or Neat Boutique, in direct competition with the finest European manufacturers. At the Chicago World's Columbian Exposition of 1893, Waltham's exhibit drew crowds examining the live production line with the same mixture of astonishment and civic pride that had greeted it at Philadelphia 17 years earlier. These were not consolation prizes for an American company competing on home soil. They were verdicts delivered by international juries that included European horological experts who understood exactly what they were evaluating. The Swiss knew. They had been evaluating Waltham movements since 1876, and the results consistently told them the same thing. The machine-made American product outperformed their finest handmade equivalents. By 1900, the factory's cumulative output had passed 10 million watches. 1 in 5 Americans owned a personal timepiece, a ratio that had been 1 in 20 just 30 years earlier. That transformation had a single primary cause. If you were an ordinary American in 1900 who owned a watch and could afford one, the overwhelming probability was that it said Waltham on the dial. The company's reach had become cultural as well as commercial. In 1883, when the American railroad industry finally forced the country to standardize its time zones, reducing the hundreds of local times in use across the continent to 4, the railroads driving that standardization were running on Waltham time. The synchronized nation that resulted, where noon meant the same thing in Cleveland as it meant in Pittsburgh, was a consequence of the need for railroad watches to agree with each other. Personal timekeeping, ideale Prenti, The idea that an individual person could know what time it was and be expected to act accordingly had been transformed by the 40 million timepieces this factory was in the process of producing. The historian who traces American punctuality, the office worker whose calendar runs in 15-minute increments, the athlete whose training is measured in split seconds, all of them are living inside a temporal structure that Waltham's watches helped impose on the culture. In 1894, Waltham introduced the Vanguard movement, 18 size, either 17 or 21 jewels, depending on specification. Advertised without qualification as the finest railroad watch movement produced by any manufacturer anywhere. In the observatory testing that railroad certification required, Vanguard movements performed at levels that should have been impossible for machine-produced instruments, accuracy that rivaled hand-adjusted Swiss observatory-grade pieces. The Swiss manufacturers who purchased Waltham movements for their own testing, evaluating them at observatories in Neuchâtel and Geneva, reported accuracy that exceeded what their finest hand-assembled watches achieved. They had stolen the method. They had not yet equaled the product. Ernest Shackleton carried Waltham chronometers aboard the Endurance on his 1914 Antarctic expedition. Robert Peary had used Waltham instruments at the North Pole. In May of 1927, Charles Lindbergh navigated the first non-stop transatlantic flight from Roosevelt Field in New York to Le Bourget Aerodrome in Paris, 33.5 hours across the Atlantic, without radio navigation, without landmarks for most of the journey, using a Waltham Exit Type 37 aeronautical clock. He found France in the darkness, then Paris, then the field. He found them by Waltham time. The company that had put a watch on Abraham Lincoln's wrist at Gettysburg was now navigating solo aircraft across oceans, the standard for precision in conditions where imprecision killed. Beneath the dominance, though, something had been quietly going wrong for years. Consultants brought in by management in the early 1900s found a company that had not been run as a unified organization in a very long time. 25 autonomous departments, each operating with its own schedules, its own hiring, its own production logic, and minimal coordination with the departments adjacent to it. The result was a workforce of 4,000 people accomplishing work that 2,000 efficiently organized workers could have handled. Unsold inventory had accumulated to $11 million. Finished and partially finished watches sitting in storage while the factory produced more. Products were priced 15 to 25% above competitors' equivalent offerings, a premium the market had once accepted but was increasingly refusing. In 1910, a coalition of minority stockholders forced sufficient board changes to place control with a new majority. None of them were watchmakers. They were financial men who understood balance sheets and not the technical requirements of precision manufacturing. The problem they had identified was real. The solution they chose, financial restructuring without operational reform, did not address it. Then Europe went to war. The precision machinery that cut watch escapements to thousandths of an inch could cut timing mechanisms for artillery shells to the same tolerances. Military fuses require precise time intervals. The difference between a shell detonating on impact and detonating on a time delay is a matter of micromechanical precision no human hand could produce at the volumes the war required. Waltham's equipment could produce them. The factory that had spent 60 years building machines that made watches now applied that entire apparatus to building mechanisms for war. The tooling changed. The precision was identical. Between 1915 and 1918, Waltham converted substantial production capacity to time fuse manufacturing and watched its revenues nearly double. Earnings over the war years rose 156%. The war money was real, and it was substantial. What it concealed was equally real. The profits absorbed, without correcting, the operational dysfunction that had been compounding since the early 1900s. Executive salaries had reached over $100,000 annually in a company whose workers earned a few dollars a day. The structural inefficiency identified by consultants a decade earlier had not been addressed. It had been ignored because the war was generating enough money that ignoring it was comfortable. When the war ended, the money stopped. The dysfunction did not. Between 1916 and 1918, a separate development produced something more consequential than profit margins. An American inventor named Charles Depollier had been working on a watch case designed for the specific conditions of the Western Front. Trenches filled with mud and standing water. Gas attacks with chlorine and mustard agents that infiltrated and destroyed conventional watch cases within hours. Standard pocket watches were failing so consistently in field conditions that keeping accurate time, a military necessity, had become functionally impossible for soldiers in the line. Depollier's solution was a crown bezel caseback sealing system that created a genuine hermetic barrier against water and contaminants. He housed Waltham movements in these cases. In 1918, the United States Army Signal Corps Laboratory and the United States Bureau of Standards conducted formal certification testing and confirmed the result. The world's first waterproof watch, certified, tested, demonstrated. Every waterproof timepiece on Earth today traces directly to this moment and this factory's movements. Every dive watch, every Rolex Submariner, every Omega Seamaster, every certified water-resistant watch of every brand and price point. The sealing technology descends from Depollier's design wrapped around a Waltham movement, certified by the United States Army in 1918. Rolex introduced its Oyster waterproofing in 1926, 8 years later, to global celebration and permanent historical recognition. The Depollier Field and Marine Watch remains almost entirely unknown outside specialist circles. Waltham got there first. History chose to remember the second. When the Second World War came, the Massachusetts factory converted its entire operation to military production, not partially, entirely. The benches where watchmakers had spent careers assembling civilian timepieces were now building instruments of a different kind of precision. Gyroscopes for aircraft navigation, the devices that kept aircraft level when pilots could not see the horizon, whose failure meant a spiraling dive into clouds the pilot never saw coming. Precision compasses for naval vessels. Time delay fuses for bombs and torpedoes, where fractions of a second determined the difference between a direct hit and a near miss. The A-11 military wristwatch issued broadly to Allied forces. Then the A-17 pilot's watch, certified under military specification. MIL-W-6-4-3-3, the first military watch ever produced with 24-hour time markings specifically designed for aviation navigation. Where a pilot navigating by dead reckoning over featureless ocean needed to know not just the hour, but whether it was 2 in the afternoon or 2 in the morning. The United States Air Force purchased more than 100,000 A-17s. The workers who had spent their careers assembling civilian timepieces for railroad conductors and collectors were now assembling the instruments that flew Allied bombers over Germany and timed the detonation of weapons dropped on Pacific islands. That factory that had begun by teaching America what time it was had become a factory that helped determine where bombs fell. In 1945, with the war won and military contracts winding down, Waltham posted a net profit of $211,200. It was the last money the company ever made. Behind the production statistics, behind the military contracts and the gold medals and the presidential watches and the polar expeditions and the transatlantic flights, were the people who built all of it, 2,400 of them at peak. Men and women who arrived before the 7 o'clock whistle found their bench beneath those arched windows and spent the next 8 to 10 hours handling objects that could barely be felt between the fingers. This was skilled labor in ways that almost no factory work was. You could not arrive hungover. You could not be rough-handed. You could not lose concentration for 20 seconds without ruining work that represented hours of accumulated effort. A watchmaker fitting a pallet fork to an escapement wheel was not performing assembly line labor in any meaningful sense. She was performing surgery on a miniature machine, working under magnification, with instruments that weighed almost nothing, to standards that allowed no error. A misaligned jewel hole. A pivot seated a fraction out of true. Work that passed visual inspection might still fail in the movement. A watch that ran fast, ran slow, or stopped without warning days after it was sold. The quality control department tested every movement before it left the factory. The standard was not acceptable. It was correct or it was rejected. When Jacques David had moved through the factory floor in 1876, what had struck him most was the silence. Not the silence of coercion, no shouting foreman, no visible intimidation, no sign, he recorded, of slavery in any of its American forms. The silence came from concentration. Some workshops had been decorated by the workers themselves. Curtains on the windows, paintings on the walls, photographs of the workers' own faces, flowers in small arrangements on the benches. David, who had expected something resembling the brutal industrial environments he knew from European heavy manufacturing, found something he had no clear category for, a form of collective craftsmanship that happened to be performed by machines. Women made up a significant portion of the assembly and finishing workforce throughout the company's existence. The assignment of women to watchmaking reflected a cultural consensus about female hands, delicate, patient, suited to fine work, that the era deployed as both description and justification. The justification it served was economic. The same skill that was attributed to feminine nature was simultaneously defined as less valuable than masculine skill, permitting comparable precision work to be compensated at substantially lower rates. The gap existed throughout the company's history and was never formally corrected. The bonus system introduced for female workers in the 1870s reinforced the arrangement. Rather than individual wages subject to negotiation, groups of women competed monthly for a collective reward based on total output. Production was maximized. Individual bargaining power was eliminated. The productivity gains flowed upward. The women who assembled the movements that won gold medals in Paris and Philadelphia were paid less than the men who worked beside them. Their names do not appear on the gold medals. Multi-generational employment was common enough to be unremarkable. Grandfather, father, son, mother, daughter. Workers who had given 40 years to Waltham walked in the annual company parade and received formal recognition at retirement. The social contract felt real for decades because it was real. The factory was the largest employer in Waltham. It had extended credit to its workers in lean times. And it had built the community's identity so thoroughly around itself that the factory's image appeared on the city's seal. Being a Waltham worker was a civic identity as much as an occupational one. The city and the factory had grown up together over 70 years, each dependent on the other's survival in ways that neither would have chosen to test. That contract was tested and broken in the 1920s. Management, under pressure from creditors and a board that understood the financial statements better than it understood watchmaking, began cutting wages in 1924, without negotiation and without notice. On August 11th, workers left their benches. Within days, 2,800 of Waltham's 2,900 total employees had joined the work stoppage. Workers who had given 50 years to the company, entire lives. From apprentice to near retirement, marched through the streets of Waltham in a procession of 2,000 people to a rally in the city park. Plant Superintendent Monsieur E. Boucher refused to meet with representatives of the workers as an organized group. His position was that he would speak with employees individually. As individuals, he declared that all workers who had left their benches were no longer employees and must reapply for their positions one by one. The logic was deliberate. You are individual units, interchangeable and replaceable. It was the same logic that made the watches. Every part produced to identical specification, every part substitutable for any other. The philosophy of precision manufacturing deployed against the people who embodied it. The strike lasted until January 8th, 1925, nearly 5 months. The workers returned to benches they had built their lives around, to a company that had just demonstrated what it thought their lives were worth. To understand why 1,200 of them walked out of those buildings for the last time on a February morning in 1950, you have to hold two things simultaneously. The first is the compounding internal failure, the structural mismanagement that had been identified and ignored for decades, that the war profits had papered over, that the 1924 strike had not corrected, that the corporate governance had consistently declined to address. The second is what was arriving from outside while the internal failure accumulated. Inside, 25 autonomous departments, 4,000 workers doing 2,000 workers' jobs, $11 million in unsold inventory. Products priced 15 to 25% above what the market would pay. A board of financial men making technical decisions. A workforce whose loyalty had been tested to near breaking by the 1924 strike and had been silently calibrating its relationship to the company ever since. Outside, the Swiss had come. American soldiers returning from the Second World War had spent years in Europe, where Swiss manufacturers had operated throughout the conflict from the protected position of a neutral country. While Waltham made bomb fuses and gyroscopes, Longinis and Omega and Rolex had continued making watches. Better watches, smaller watches, watches designed for wrists rather than pockets, watches whose quality had been refined throughout the years, when American manufacturers had been making instruments of war instead. Soldiers brought Swiss watches home. They showed them to their families. The phrase "running like a Swiss watch" entered American civilian conversation as the highest compliment you could pay a mechanism. Swiss manufacturers had rebuilt, modernized, and were now producing wristwatches at prices lower than American manufacturers could match, with labor costs a fraction of Waltham's and government trade support that American companies had no equivalent of. Waltham compounded the external pressure with an internal failure to adapt. The market had been shifting from pocket watches to wristwatches since the First World War, when soldiers had found pocket watches impractical in combat conditions and adopted wrist-worn instruments that could be read without using both hands. The shift had continued through the 1920s and 30s. By 1945, the wristwatch was the standard consumer timepiece across the developed world. Waltham remained organized around high-grade pocket watch production, the category that had built its reputation, that its machinery was configured to produce, and that the market was systematically abandoning. The company lacked the tooling and the design capacity to compete in wristwatch production at the volumes and prices the post-war consumer market required. By 1954, American-made watches had fallen from 52% of the domestic market in 1940 to just 18%. The final mechanism of failure was financial and specific. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation, a federal government lending body, had committed $6 million in loans to support Waltham's operations through its reorganization. $4 million had been delivered. When the final installment of $2 million came up for disbursement, the RFC declined. $2 million. In a company that had once posted profits of 164% of capital in a single year, the inability to obtain $2 million from the federal government was the immediate trigger. The distance between those two facts is the precise measurement of how far the company had traveled. December 28, 1948. The Waltham Watch Company filed for reorganization in the Federal District Court of Boston. Federal Judge George C. Sweeney reviewed the reorganization plan the following year and approved it. His assessment: "An examination of the balance sheet satisfies me that with careful management, the company will be able to function safely and satisfactorily." He was correct about the potential. He could not have known that careful management was precisely what would continue to be unavailable. February 3, 1950. The factory on Crescent Street closed. 1,200 workers, some of whose parents had worked these same benches, some of whose children had been born during their tenure at Waltham, walked out for what most assumed was the last time. The machines went quiet. The arched windows flooded empty floors with morning light that had nobody to illuminate. Korean War defense contracts briefly reopened the doors. In 1951, the first profitable year since the war, Waltham posted a net profit of $11,728. $11,000. The company that had operated at 164% of capital had returned $11,000. Military contracts sustained a workforce of approximately 1,000 workers through the early years of the decade, enough to keep the lights on, enough for a federal judge to conclude that function remained possible. It was not enough. In 1957, consumer watch manufacturing permanently ceased. The company reorganized as Waltham Precision Instruments, a maker of specialized clocks for aircraft. The name Waltham Watch Company was sold to the Hallmark Watch Company of Chicago, which applied it to watches manufactured overseas and distributed them through American retail channels. In 1974, more watches bearing the name Waltham were sold in the United States than had been sold in 1954. Not one of them was made in Waltham. Not one of them was made in America. The name had outlasted the factory, the company, the craft, and the city that had given all of them their identity, and it was selling its own ghost. Empty factories don't disappear overnight. They stand there, losing pieces of themselves to weather and neglect and the quiet indifference of time, while the world around them argues about whether the history they represent is worth the cost of preserving it. In 1961, the First Republic Corporation of America purchased the Crescent Street complex and converted it to multi-tenant light manufacturing and warehousing. The buildings that had held the world's most exacting manufacturing operation became general storage. The arched windows, designed for the eyes of people handling components measured in thousandths of an inch, now looked out over loading docks and parking lots. The largest tenant, growing over years until it occupied approximately 75% of the complex, was Panametrics, a manufacturer of precision measurement instruments. The echo of the building's heritage was probably coincidental. Whatever the reason, precision had not entirely abandoned the address. The years passed. The workers who had been at those benches in 1950 grew old in Waltham, in the same neighborhoods where they had lived while they worked, walking past a factory that now stored other people's equipment in the spaces where they had spent their working lives. Their children grew up hearing what the place had been. The grandchildren of the 1890s workforce, people whose grandparents had marched in that 2,000-person strike parade of 1924, were now middle-aged residents of a city whose largest employer was gone and whose identity was anchored to an absence. The city kept the factory's image on its seal and continued calling itself Watch City, an identity built on an industry that had ceased to operate within its borders a generation earlier. It was not denial. It was a refusal to pretend the history had not happened, even when there was no longer any economic basis for the pride. The buildings remained because they were built from materials that do not easily fail. Brick laid by craftsmen in the 1860s, pointed with mortar that matched the masonry's thermal expansion, heavy timber framing cut from old-growth wood that was already decades old when it was milled, roofs maintained by a succession of tenants who needed them functional. Decay accumulated at the margins. Ornamental stonework deteriorating, window frames rotting where water pooled, the mechanical infrastructure within growing more obsolete with each decade that passed. But the bones held. The structure stood. In 1989, the complex was listed on the state and national registers of historic places. This was not merely honorary. The designation formalized what the city had been implicitly claiming for decades, that these buildings were not simply old structures awaiting redevelopment or demolition, but physical evidence of a chapter of American history that was specific, significant, and unrepeatable. More practically, the designation made the complex eligible for historic tax credits, federal and state financial instruments that made the economics of rehabilitation substantially more viable than they would otherwise have been. The city that had honored the factory by keeping its image on the seal had, without necessarily planning it, also preserved it long enough to qualify for the financial mechanism that would eventually save it. In 2004, General Electric acquired Panametrics and relocated its operations. Approximately 75% of 400,000 square feet of historic industrial space along the Charles River 10 miles from Boston was now empty. The arched windows still faced the river. The heavy timber framing was still structurally sound. The bones of the complex were, by any assessment, extraordinary. The systems were not. Plumbing, electrical, HVAC, all obsolete, all requiring wholesale replacement. Seismic standards had advanced significantly since the 1870s, when the buildings were constructed without benefit of modern structural engineering. Bringing the complex into compliance with current code would require substantial steel interventions throughout the existing structure. The question facing the city, the historic preservation community, and any developer willing to consider the property was the question that faces every piece of significant industrial heritage. The past is worth preserving in principle. Is it worth $118 million in practice? In May of 2007, Watch City Ventures LLC, an affiliate of the Boston-based real estate developer Berkeley Investments, acquired the property and answered the question affirmatively, with a $118 million commitment to find out. Berkeley brought in Brunner and Cott Associates of Cambridge, Massachusetts, a firm that had spent decades specializing in the adaptive reuse of historic industrial buildings, the conversion of factories and mills and warehouses into viable contemporary spaces without erasing what made them worth preserving. The project was planned in 3 phases. Construction financing of $40 million came from U.S. Bank. Federal and state historic tax credit investment totaling $16 million came from Bank of America as the primary investor. The 1989 historic designation was doing its financial work. It had made these credits available, and the credits made the budget possible. The total projected cost of $118 million required every available instrument of historic rehabilitation finance working simultaneously. Phase 1, completed in May of 2009, converted the primary buildings into 160,000 square feet of brick and beam office space. The lobby of the main building was renovated to include a permanent historical exhibit on the Waltham Watch Company. Photographs, artifacts, chronological timeline, the story of the people and the watches, and the century of production displayed in the space where that century had happened. Phase 2 created 96 residential loft apartments within the complex. Phase 3 added 67 additional residential units and a structured parking facility. The complete redevelopment delivered 171,000 square feet of office space and 163 residential units. An enclosed pedestrian bridge connected buildings across the internal courtyards. A cafe and full-service restaurant opened on the ground floor. Riverfront docks for kayaking and small watercraft were installed along the Charles River frontage. A public walking and cycling path connected the complex to Waltham's Historic Center. The project received the 2014 Green Innovation Award from the U.S. Green Building Council's Massachusetts chapter for its stormwater management system. Rain gardens developed in collaboration with the Charles River Watershed Association that captured, filtered, and cooled runoff before returning it to the river. What Brunner and Cott understood about the building, and what guided every decision in the rehabilitation, was that the original design logic had not expired. The building had been engineered around its function, the production of objects requiring absolute precision by workers who needed natural light to see what they were doing. That function was finished. The engineering was not. The arched windows that had lit the watchmakers' benches now lit open office plans with the same quality of diffuse northern light that watchmakers had required. The narrow, high-ceilinged wings, proportioned to accommodate 2 facing rows of production benches with a central aisle, now accommodated open office arrangements with the same spatial logic. The exposed brick and heavy timber preserved throughout, not as decoration but as structural reality, create an environment of material honesty that contemporary buildings, with their suspended ceilings and concealed systems, cannot replicate. Nothing in the adaptive reuse required the building to become something other than what it had been. It was asked only to continue providing a space where serious work could happen to people who were not the people it had originally been built for. The building director of operations, describing the experience of opening floors and walls during construction, put it plainly: nothing's ever as straightforward with adaptive reuse as building a new building. The history embedded in the structure presented constant surprises: load paths that didn't match any surviving drawing, materials that resisted modification in ways that required custom solutions, spatial conditions that had no contemporary code equivalent. Every revelation required adaptation. The building negotiated its own preservation, imposing on the architects the same discipline it had once imposed on the watchmakers. Work to what is actually here, not to what you expected to find. Today, the complex at 185 Crescent Street, Waltham, Massachusetts, called the Watch Factory, contains 171,000 square feet of first-class office space and 163 loft apartments, a cafe and restaurant, a history exhibit, riverfront docks, and a public riverside path. Workers arriving for their shifts pass the historical exhibit in the lobby. Residents walking to the river pass it too. A person who moves into one of those apartments or takes an office in one of those renovated wings inhabits a space that was built to an exact specification of human labor. The need to see precisely, to reach precisely, to be undisturbed precisely. And now serves a different generation of people doing a different kind of precise work in the light those windows were always designed to provide. The building has not changed its purpose, it has changed its occupants. The city still calls itself Watch City. The seal still carries the factory's image. And somewhere in the permanent exhibit in that lobby, among the photographs and the chronological panels and the surviving movements under glass, is the record of what this building was for, and what it cost, and what it made possible, and what was taken from it, and how it ended, and why it is still standing. Aaron Lufkin Dennison died in Birmingham, England, in January of 1895, making watch cases for the Swiss manufacturers, whose industry his idea had once come within a generation of destroying, whose spies had taken what he built and turned it against the country that had produced him, and whose name now appears on watches sold under the Waltham trademark. He was 82 years old. He was buried in a city that was not his own. He is known to specialists and almost entirely unknown to everyone else. Here is the accounting of what Waltham gave the world. The American system of manufacturing extended to precision goods. The direct conceptual ancestor of every modern production line on Earth. The democratization of personal timekeeping, putting accurate watches into the hands of ordinary working people for the first time in human history. The synchronization of America's railroads, and through 52 countries' adoption of Waltham standards, a significant portion of the world's rail networks. The world's first waterproof watch, predating the celebrated version by 8 years. The aeronautical clock that guided the first non-stop transatlantic flight. Abraham Lincoln's watch at Gettysburg, the assembly line principle that Henry Ford turned into the Model T and the automobile industry and every mass-produced object that followed. Here is what the world gave Waltham in return. A bankruptcy filing in 1948, a factory closure in 1950, a name sold to a Chicago company for use on watches made overseas, and eventually the Waltham trademark transferred to Switzerland, to the country whose industrial spies stole the secrets. In 1876, whose imported watches killed the market in the 1940s, and who now manufacture mechanical watches under the Waltham name in the country that destroyed the original company. The Swiss did not take Waltham's future once. They took it twice. First the methods, then the name. Every assembly line in the world carries Waltham's fingerprint. The factory that taught Henry Ford his fundamental insight is now apartments along a Massachusetts river. The watch company that beat the Swiss is now a Swiss trademark. The cobbler's son from Maine, who refused to make shoes, died making cases for the people who outlasted him, in a country that was not his, and the city that bears his factory's image on its seal calls itself Watch City without, most days, pausing to consider what that means or what it cost. He invented the modern world. We just forgot to remember him. This is the dark story of the Waltham Watch Company. It is not over. It has just moved to Switzerland.